Hi, my name is Mark Estel. My focus was on the 1940s, and I decided to focus on beer's influence primarily during World War II and how it helped boost the morale of troops in winning the war against the Nazis. So, just a brief background. The temperance movement was something that was big during the 20th century. Temperance movement was essentially just a social movement against the consumption of alcoholic beverages, prominent in the 1920s. The 18th Amendment was passed to prohibit the manufacturing and selling of and distribution of alcoholic beverages. During this Prohibition era, there was a spike in illegal activity, the creation of speakeasies, because although the 18th Amendment did prohibit manufacturing, it did not prohibit consumption of alcohol. Until 1933, that's when Prohibition ended. It was repealed. The 21st Amendment repealed the 18th Amendment. And so, entering World War II, you're looking at about 8 years after the temperance movement had really ended. There were certain vices that soldiers missed from home, and alcohol was a really big one. This resurgence of prohibition came from the argument that in World War I, because there was a moratorium on alcohol, that troops should be allowed to consume alcohol, whether or not they should be able to consume alcohol on the premises of military bases. So the temperance movement, they argued essentially that beer production wastes vital foodstuffs and diverts manpower from urgent wartime needs. Secretary of War Henry Stimson at the time, he deemed beer necessary. His whole idea, the reason why he supported the wet argument, meaning people that are in support of consumption of alcohol, is that flat prohibition would likely invite greater excesses to the soldiers, and so inevitably they'd be turned to speakeasies and bootleggers outside the camp. So it was better to achieve temperance through this over here. So what they essentially did is that they allowed a 3.2 ABV level, and so it was able to be monitored and supervised by the officials on military bases. He claimed that beer production contributed to the morale of soldiers, a better morale for soldiers. So the federal government, in support of him, they required breweries in the U.S. to set aside 15% of their wartime production of beer for American troops. The bill that was trying to get pushed by Morris Shepherd, he was trying to propose a ban on all alcohol and create these things called moral zones. Moral zones were essentially places where this illegal activity would happen, like prostitution and things of that sort. So that's what he was really trying to do. He's really trying to get the temperance movement back into the fold. So the whole argument of dry versus wet, like I said earlier, dry supporters are essentially just followers of the temperance movement. They believe beer production is detrimental to troops, and they argue it would lead to the eventually we would end up losing the war if we decided to consume beer and alcohol. Wet supporters were anti-prohibition. They believe that the temperance movement was just trying to manipulate the government into using powers and abusing their military authority in that regard. And so they ultimately protest the bill. The dry petitions, even though they outnumber the wet petitions, a lot of military officials still shared the wet supporters' views. They ended up doing that practice of selling the light beer on military premises. 3.2% ABV was considered light, and it's going to be on military premises where it was going to be supervised and controlled. The anti-prohibition sentiment was really big in terms of literature. A lot of people were saying that C.L. Chapman, man is old enough to drive a tank and fly a bomber, but not manly enough to go sit down in the barracks with a beer and without being judged. Chicago Daily News was kind of that same way. They believe the roots of dry agitation probably lie in the jealousy of soldiers by old women in pants. Generation Vipers by Philip Wiley. This is where they coined the term momism. Essentially, it's this whole entire maternal instinct. It's overly protecting, mothering, and their argument was that it made sons weak and passive. And so essentially the anti-prohibition sentiment was also sick and tired of the feminine influence, because that's essentially what a lot of the temperance movement was. It was a lot of women and a lot of religious zealots that were in that. And so that's why they were totally against in terms of banning alcohol. And it ended up failing. The Shepherd's Bill was just one of many that failed between 1942 and 1944 in terms of trying to ban alcohol. And so this whole entire strategy that they tried using from World War I, it didn't work out the second go around. The Brewers' strategy, meaning the wet supporters, they enlisted the help of a J. Walter Thompson over here. He had a multi-pronged campaign aimed at distinct consumer political constituencies. He really focused on the Americans in small towns and rural areas, mainly because he believed that the farmers were the backbone and the essential workers that helped produce beer, and in producing beer helped produce a stronger morale for the troops. Breweries didn't really have that much competition. Distilleries were designated to manufacture industrial alcohol instead, so the only competition or only fighting that they were encountering was the temperance movement and the prohibitionist dry supporters. Thompson had a slew of propaganda techniques. He created this character by the name of Joe Marsh, who fought against the Salsa prohibitionist school of thought. He essentially made Joe Marsh a supporter of brewers, and he made the character seem as if you supported brewers, you were protecting American liberty, and he deemed prohibitionists as the enemy, prohibitionists as enemies, and he even went on to say that they were like Nazi sympathizers, which is kind of what the temperance movement was trying to do in terms of talking about the wet supporters, how alcohol was detrimental to the war effort, and that's essentially why France ended up being occupied by Germany, is because the Burgundy France, they're really big on their wine, so it ultimately led to their downfall. And so it was just this bickering back and forth in terms of like what they were trying to get their points across. So these are some of his ideas. There's the Joe Marsh, one of his columns. He put in like magazines like Time Magazine, a lot of mainstream magazines. You have this, it's called the Morale is a Lot of Little Things. Essentially, the background behind this propaganda from this strip is that as long as you work hard, you essentially deserve to enjoy the freedoms like a refreshing beer. And so it's parallel to the troops in that regard, meaning that they're working hard and sacrificing their lives overseas, and so they ultimately deserve a chance at their vices and being able to enjoy the freedoms that we have over here, which is consuming beer. Another reason why the temperance movement didn't really take this time around is in the 1930s, the stigma of alcohol as deviant was really gone. You had films that were displaying consumption of alcohol a lot of the time. And really the chaplains and the members of the church, it was literally just the hierarchies that were preaching against this alcohol consumption rather than the congregations. You have Robert Ranspeck over here. He's a Georgian congressman. He went on saying, I don't want 10,000 boys coming home the way 4 million died from the last war, and saying, you voted my drinks away while I was gone. So essentially he didn't want to cause any waves in anything in terms of what had already passed. So what beer stands for essentially is good consumerism with good citizenship. Beer is an essential right for which men are fighting, and men have the right to enjoy refreshing beer. And sales rose from to 80 million when they were at about 56.8 million in 1941. That's Schlitz. That's one of the bigger, along with Anheuser-Busch, one of the bigger beer producers during the war effort that did a lot of that propaganda in terms of, showing that the troops deserve all the beer production that they can get over there. As you see, every fourth bottle of Schlitz goes overseas. This is just some propaganda in support of beer. You have the screw battle, we're getting drunk. And that goes back to the whole idea that beer is a vice that a lot of these troops miss from home. So the idea of the reason why the federal government, I feel, you see that they supported the wet support, they supported alcohol consumption, is because they deemed that alcohol is what boosted morale and made them more comfortable. And so in doing so, they get comfortable with these rewards, they'll fight, and they'll be able to accomplish their goal of defeating the Nazis and be able to return home. You have an Anheuser-Busch, this is a Clydesdale. So with the shortage in gasoline, they resorted back to horse carriage in terms of transferring their products. You have these olive green beer bottles. These beer bottles, the reason why they were olive green, it's to mask from the enemy. Beer cans were also something big that happened during the 1940s. Because of the shortage in glass, because bottles were a luxury, they instead resorted to putting them in cans, and they actually brought that back into the 1950s. It became the can became a little cooler and edgy, and so that's why that still remains to this day. Right over here, this tent, it's the post-exchange system. It's where the troops would be able to consume their alcohol and get their alcohol. And they have the HMS Menestheus. It was one of two ships that was able to be produced. Since they were supposed to go to the Pacific, where beer unfortunately went rancid and was spoiled easily. So these ships were designated with the idea of Winston Churchill to help the Allies in terms of being able to enjoy beers in the Pacific. But because the war ended in 1945, only one of these left the shipyard, and they were supposed to be tents, and they weren't just supposed to be just places where that stored all the alcohol. It was also supposed to be including cinemas and dance halls. But that's a presentation of beer apprentices in the 1940s. Thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed it.